everybody. Welcome in. It's nice to see you all today. While we have everybody piling in, welcome to Conversations with Authors. Today we bring to you Peter Heller and his newest novel, The Guide. It should be a really excellent conversation, but before we get to our authors properly, let me introduce you to Book Passage's Conversations with Authors series, which is where you are right now. If you're absolutely new here, well then this introduction is for you. If you've seen one of these events before, well then welcome back. We're very lucky to have you, and we hope to see you in the coming events or in our future events. But if you are new here, Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we host and run book talks just like this one very often throughout the week, both online and upcoming very soon. We will be holding, we will be holding book talks in stores in person, although in a very protected and kind of limited capacity. But nonetheless, we will be holding in-person book talks. I'm absolutely incredibly excited to hold them once again. Just so you know, if we are on, as we are online and streaming on YouTube, and we'll definitely continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It's completely free to you, and honestly, truthfully helps us out, and additionally, lets you know every time we go live. So if we come on for events just like this one, you'll be alerted every single time, and you can come and watch whatever it is, almost always completely for free. Next, if you would like to check out our upcoming events and like the idea of a newsletter more, you can find both our upcoming events and the newsletter at bookpassage.com. It's an excellently done newsletter, if I do say so myself, if I can just pat myself on the back a little bit. But if you'd like to check that out, you can find it at bookpassage.com. If you want to check out tonight's book, which is The Guide, or anything else that's mentioned here tonight, any of Don George's books, for instance, you can find all of it in the description below the video, or from me spamming the book's titles periodically in the YouTube chat. And finally, and this one is very important, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please do take the time to write them in the YouTube chat. It's always incredible to answer your questions, and I've never met a single author that doesn't want to answer your questions. So please do, if you have any of them, write them in the chat, and I will make sure to send them over to our speakers today. Okay, now allow me to introduce our authors. Peter Heller, who is the author of our book today, is the national best-selling author of The River, Celine, The Painter, and The Dog Stars. The Painter was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and won the prestigious Reading the West Book Award. The Dog Stars has been published in 22 languages to date. Heller is also the author of 4 nonfiction books, including Kook, What Surfing Taught Me About Love, Life, and Catching the Perfect Wave, which was awarded the National Outdoor Book Award for Literature. He holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop in Poetry and Fiction, and lives in Denver, Colorado. In conversation today, we have Don George, who I think is probably the most recurring guest that's on this show, which I'm very excited to have him. If anybody's going to be a recurring guest, it's going to be Don George. But he is the author of The Way of Wanderlust, the best travel writing of Don George, and of Lonely Planet's Guide to Travel Writing, and is the editor of 10 anthologies, including A Movable Feast, The Kindness of Strangers, Better Than Fiction, and An Innocent Abroad. George is the editor-at-large for National Geographic's Traveler, where he writes feature articles and the monthly Trip Lit column. He is also editor of BBC Travel's literary travel column, Chance Encounters. We are so lucky to have the both of them here with us today. And let me get off the screen as fast as possible and pass it off to these two wonderful speakers. Welcome, Peter and Don.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for that wonderful, great introduction. Great to be here. Peter, it's such a thrill and pleasure to see you. I wish we were in person, but this is pretty great. It's really great. You've been an inspiration for me for a long time. And I actually want to begin delving back deep into the past. If you don't mind, I want to pay homage to a story you wrote when I was just starting out as a travel editor at the San Francisco Examiner in the late 1980s. You wrote a story called Set Free in China. Do you remember that piece?
Oh, man. Yes, I do. And you, by the way, just so people know, that was my first big travel assignment. And I think you gave me my second one as an editor, travel editor. So Thank
Yeah,
you.
those were the
It really
days.
pretty cool to see you now.
Well, it's great to see you. Can you give people a super quick summary of what Set Free in China was about? Because I want to say a few words about it, but I'd rather have you
Yeah.
say what it was about.
So just to say how that started, I was writing poetry in my room in Boulder, Colorado, at a cheap house I was sharing with a friend, and delivering pizza, and teaching kayaking. And a friend said, you should write for Outside Magazine. You're like kayaking all this crazy stuff, and you're just writing in your room. Combine your interests. So I called him up and I said, I think you should send me to the Tibetan Plateau to run this river that's never been run. And they did. I said, we're going to take a chance on you. And I went, and it was 3 kayakers and a bunch of rafts. We were doing a practice run, gear shakedown, up on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. The Himalayas were above us. You could see there was black with storm and lightning, and the river was rising as we were getting ready. And by the time we put onto this little class 4 practice run, it was a raging flood. And I remember I was surfing a wave to warm up, and I peeled out. I came around the bend, and there was one of the rafts doing cartwheels, empty, in a big hole, hydraulic. And I sprinted ahead. I saw a helmet in the water and big waves. I turned my stern for the rafter to grab my stern for a rescue, and we hit a big wave, and he couldn't grab it. And then I saw a big log jam along the left bank. I hit the shore somehow without going into the log jam, and there were 2 helmets stuck in the logs, in a funnel of logs. I scrambled out. The other kayaker was right there. We pulled the one who was behind off. He was still alive. Brought him to shore. It was the guy that I'd missed in the river. And then we went back for the second trap person, and we pulled, and we put a pulley system on him, and we just couldn't pull him out. And the river was rising, and I remember I held his head and tried to keep his head above the water, and the water rose over his head, and he died in my arms. And I had to paddle across the river until he was a newlywed. They were on their honeymoon, and I had to tell his wife that her new husband was dead. And I remember that assignment because it stayed with me in a way that no other one has. It was my first magazine assignment, and I had brought with me a book of Tang Dynasty poetry to read, just to sort of get the heart of the place that I was going to. And I've done that ever since with, when I traveled, brought a book of poems. And we gathered by the river the next day, and we sang Amazing Grace. And I read a poem from this book. 27 years later, when I finished The Dog Stars, my first novel, which I wrote in a white heat, I just sat down at the coffee shop and I told myself, don't think, just listen. And then it was as if this guy Hig was across the campfire from me on an October night with the flames blowing around in the wind. And he was telling me what had happened to him a few years before. It was this amazing experience, thrilling experience. And I finished the novel. I got to the last page, and Hig said, and my favorite poem is written by Li Shangyin, and it was written in the 9th century. And it was the poem that I'd read for Dave 27 years before it came fluttering out of the universe and landed on. I didn't even know that I knew it. And Jeez. It was called When Will I Be Home? I'm just going to say it because it's so beautiful. Sure. When will I be home? I don't know. In the mountains, in the rainy night, the autumn lake is flooded. One day, we will be back together again. We will sit in the candlelight by the west window, and I will tell you how I remembered you tonight on the stormy mountain. That's the thing about writing fiction that's so beautiful and magical, is that I didn't even know that I knew the poem anymore.
Well, I'm about to dissolve into tears again. That was, wow, what you just said was amazing. And it gave me goosebumps all over again. I remember, so I read that story when I was the new, fresh-faced travel editor at the San Francisco newspaper, trying to change the world through the travel section. And I came into the job believing that travel literature, travel journalism, didn't need to be just about a particular place or a particular journey, that it was about the human journey, and that really great travel writing was great writing, period. And I read that piece and I just thought, well, this is it. This is why I do what I do. And I remember getting in touch with Outside and getting in touch with you and saying, I have to reprint that story. I want to share it with my readers. And I don't know if you remember that, but I was so thrilled and inspired. You made a huge impact on me at the beginning of my career as an editor with that story. It kind of helped make me do what I've ended up doing with my editing part of my life. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
That's an incredible story. Yeah. And now you've just kept doing these amazing stories, and now you're doing fiction. I read the guide, and I literally, it was unput downable. It was so well done. And I kept telling myself, I need to eat. I need to do, you need to take a break. You can't. And I would get to the end of the chapter and I would go, well, but what's going to happen? I have to find out what's going to happen. And I really had to resist the urge to like jump ahead 50 pages and sort of see what was, I managed to resist that, but it's incredibly well done. And I wanted to talk to you about the book stylistically and thematically. But I thought maybe for those people in the audience who haven't had a chance to read it yet, do you want to give just a brief description about the book, about the story?
Sure. So it features Jack from the river, who's a young man. He's a young ranch kid from Western Colorado. He is tough, spending a day in the saddle, sleeping out under the stars, making breakfast over an open fire. They're all kind of second nature to Jack, but he's a voracious reader. He loves poetry. He went to Dartmouth and read a lot of literature. And here he is 3 years after the river, which was really a rough go for him. And he's trying to get his life back together and reconnect with the things that brought him joy. And one of those things is fly fishing. When his mother died when he was 11, which is another tragedy that he sort of holds and feels guilty about. It was a horse accident, and he blames himself for it. He's always retreated into reading and into fishing, and that's how he sort of connects. So he's got a job now at an elite luxury fly fishing lodge in Western Colorado. And he's going to work as a guide. And his first client, he hears, is going to be Allison Kay, who they use initials there, the rich and famous. And he thinks she's probably a famous country singer, but he doesn't know. And that's how the novel begins.
Right. And I'm part of the plot, and I don't want to give away very much, but part of the plot involves a pandemic. And I'm just kind of curious how and when you got the idea for the book, and how and when you started to write it in terms of the current pandemic that we're all going through.
Well, so I started the book right in the smack in the middle of COVID. And so I always start with the first line. I came up as a poet first, and that's really all I wanted to do. And when I got out of college, they didn't tell me at the English department that you can't make a living being a poet. They should have told us. That was kind of mean of those guys. But anyway, I'm really more interested in the music, the language most of the time than the story or the plot. So to make myself sort of fall in love with a new project, I just write first line whose sound I love, and then I follow that with the next, and I follow the music and the language into the story, and just have faith that that's going to take me to bump me into what I'm really concerned about. And in this book, so I mean, I'm going to show everybody the book. It's such a beautiful cover.
It's a beautiful
Kelly,
cover.
The designer, Knopf did it. She's so great. I think the first line was, let's see. They gave him a bunk in a cabin by the river, a wooded canyon, spruce and pine with rim rock up high and rock spurs that tumbled to the water. And so there was a front porch, and I was psyched because I'm a sucker for a good front porch. I mean, especially if it looks over water or the mountains. I love a porch. And then there was this guy, and he dropped his pack, and it was Jack from the river. And I was so glad to see him, because I'd been worried about him. I left him at the end of the river, brokenhearted, pretty alone, going back to the ranch to work with his father, who's very taciturn. And I had been thinking about him, and I love Jack. And so it was great to see him again. And then apparently he was working as a guide, and I thought, that's good. That'll be really good for him. Little did I know, what was going to happen. But then it occurred to me, something occurred to me that I'd heard a few years before. And I was at a book festival outside of Palm Springs at this sort of fancy resort. And I don't love book festivals so much, but the way that I make them fun is I get up early in the morning, I get a cup of coffee, and I work for a couple hours before the day starts, if it's a multi-day deal. And I went down to the breakfast table at like 6 a.m. and the only person that was there was Lee Child. And we had breakfast and we started talking about method. And I said, I just start with the first line and just sort of like, I have no idea. And I just let it rip. And he said, yeah, I do too. And I was shocked. I mean, Lee Child, have you read any of those Jack Reacher novels? I mean, they're ripping fast. Talk about not putting them down. I mean, and they seem tightly plotted. There's lots of subplots. And he said, I said, you're kidding. And he said, no, man, I throw in the first half, I throw everything against the wall. Dead bodies, lurking, menacing figures, car accidents, whatever occurs to me. And I have no clue, and I just throw it up against the wall. Second half, I mirror all of that. And then I tie up all the loose threads, and whatever doesn't tie up is a red herring, and I'm good. And I looked at him and I said, man, I have read, whole books on writing novels. I read Stephen King's book. I read John Gardner's book. And you just gave me a method in 2 lines, and pretty good. Thank you. So anyway, there I was with Jack on the porch. And I thought, I'm just going to try this for fun. Because for me, writing novels is just all about having fun. And let's try something new. So this won't give anything away because you get this in the first few pages. But I had him, his first fishing on the creek, Little River. He catches a beautiful fish, and he's really connected with his joy for the first time in a long time. And he looks up, and there's a fisheye camera lens on the pedestrian bridge. And he's pissed. He almost gives it the finger, but then he thinks, maybe the owner's watching. Not such a good attitude for his first day on the job, right? And then, he fishes up, and at the top of the private fishing water, top of the 1.5 miles, there's a post that says, don't go one step past this post, don't get shot. The downstream end is a barbed wire fence behind which are mauling dogs. I mean, I threw it all. I had no clue, not about COVID, not about anything. And I threw it all against the wall, and I was just having a gas. And what fascinates me, Don, about that method is, you have to have faith that it's all going to work out. And it suggests that we're doing so much work in our unconscious, while we're asleep, if it is going to work out, if you do that.
Right.
And somehow it did.
Wow. So that was the method. Just throw it all, everything.
Yeah. And then once I realized, COVID was in there, I had him, start to put on a mask in the very first scene. Right. I went back and put that in, but yeah, it was really fun.
That's great. So it's almost like the story already exists, basically. It's just all inside you.
It's sort of platonic, that.
Right. Right.
It might exist out there all on its own, and you just discover
it. But then, so you didn't even necessarily say, I got to get back to Jack. Jack and I have to reconnect. I've got to write another book with him. I mean, he kind of just came to you. He
showed up on that porch, man. And I was glad he was all right,
Right. I love
it. But I got worried about him again pretty fast.
I think so. So did I. That's really great. Well, I was going to ask you what was the most difficult part of writing the book. Maybe there wasn't a difficult part. Did it?
I mean, there's always, I don't know. When you follow your nose, you always run the risk of going down a cul-de-sac. And I remember when I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, I had the great fortune and boon of working with 2 incredible writers in poetry. I took both schools at once, the poetry and the fiction. And
oh, wow.
In poetry, I had Jory Graham as a teacher, who's a marvelous, poet who won a Pulitzer Prize and is a groundbreaking poet. And she said something that I'll never forget, maybe the greatest advice to a writer that I've ever heard in person. And that's something separate than what I'm about to tell you. But she said, every work of art writing, every poem is a question and begins with a question, and the poem is the answer. And don't ask the question of me, your teacher, or the critics, or your readers, the market. Ask the question of God. And I love that, and she meant God, whatever God means to you. For me, it has to do with rivers and wind and wild country. But I love that. And I've thought about it ever since. And I also had the great fortune of studying with Marilynne Robinson. And, the great novelist, Gilead, Housekeeping, all that. And I was sitting in her backyard and we were having iced tea, and I just up and asked her, because I know she'd written a lot about religion, and I up and asked her and I said, what is evil, do you think? And she said, impediment to being, without hesitation. And I have thought about that ever since, what that means. It's an incredibly nuanced and beautiful answer. And that's what, Jack runs into at this place.
Right. That was going to be my next question, was about that, the incredible passage in the book where you talk about this favorite professor saying, what is evil, the impediment to being. Can you expound a little bit on what that has come to mean for you? Because I've wondered for years now about evil, and I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, so for a long time, I wasn't sure what it meant. I thought about it and I wasn't quite sure, and I'm still not quite sure. That's the wonderful thing about that answer, is that it gives a lot to chew over. But for me, what it means, and I think what she meant by it, is anytime we subvert the natural order or the natural laws, then that is evil. And I think that's what happens in this book. So it doesn't mean, impediment to being doesn't mean the wolf taking down the elk. That is an impediment to the elk's current lifespan and life.
Right.
But not necessarily to being, which I take to mean, the entire natural order of things. And it suggests, that answer, if you take it to mean that, it suggests the presence of God somehow. If there is a natural order. And I don't know, for me, God doesn't get a whole lot past, the smell of wind, coming up a creek. So I'm lost there too, I'm just generally lost. But I think that these novels are an attempt to answer these questions.
Right.
And they're sort of outside of me in some way, which I just love.
Right. I totally agree. Boy, what you said, Jorie Graham, that's an amazing quote too. That whole idea about the question is fantastic.
Well, it helps a lot. If you get a bad review in the New York Times, it helps.
Totally. Totally. Part of what I love about the book is your descriptions of nature, especially your descriptions of fishing, but the natural world as a whole. And I'm wondering, you must be a fisherman. I assume you're a big fisherman. Is that correct in assuming that?
A little fisherman.
You're a little fisherman.
In other words, I'm not a very good fisherman, but I just love to fish. I love it. I love it. There's a creek outside. I have a little place in a town called Paonia in southwestern Colorado. It's a orchard growing valley surrounded by mountains, and 25 minutes from my house is a creek, a mountain creek. And I have fished there in every season, every time of day and night, into the dark when I can't see. It's a creek that you can wade up. Often I don't have waders and my legs go numb. It's a wooded canyon, spruce and pine with blowdown across the creek. The creek drops away from the road, and so you're in a canyon, you know, all by yourself. And oftentimes I'll look up and there's just a doe in the middle of the creek just watching me, you know, in the evening, or I'll see a bear running across. And I have fished there when I was brokenhearted. I fished there when my mother died. I fished there when my first book was published. In every mood, and it's just a touchstone for me. So, you know, I'm not a great fisherman, but I know how to fish that piece of water.
Yeah. What has fishing taught you?
About attention, I think. What is really amazing about fishing, I mean, this is the coolest thing. And I think it's about any time anybody gets in flow, right? If you're a basketball player driving down the court, you practice and practice and practice and practice. You practice your cast, you practice. It's like writing. You practice, you write stories and they suck and you throw them out. You remember the feeling of when the energy dropped and it didn't work. You remember where that happens, and you start to know where to nudge the horse over onto another trail, you know, kind of thing. Same thing with fishing. You practice, and then you are fishing. The sun is dropping on the ridge. You can see the aspen turning up on the shoulder of the mountain upstream. Smells like spruce, and none of that is anything that you're thinking about. You're just thinking about the run of water and where the eddy line is and what the wind is doing. And somehow in that circle of awareness, and I don't know how this works, but I just love this about flow. The more focused, or more, I shouldn't say focused, because it's almost like the focus comes from the activity to me after a while instead of from me to the activity. But the more attention I give to those details, the more the circle of awareness expands, so that I've become aware of you know, where the sun is on the ridge way up here and what the wind is doing over here. And, you know, maybe that bear up, you know, crossing the creek up there, but, you know, and then the magical thing is, you know, I forget my name. I forget I'm a human being, and I'm just like one other element of this evening. And it's just the most thrilling thing ever. And it's what happens when I'm writing and why I love to write.
Totally. Oh God, that was beautiful. So that was the other passage. There was the evil passage, and then the other passage that I had signaled in the book to ask you about was that paragraph that begins, "She knew how to be absorbed." There was something else Jack had noticed. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It's on page 43. Could I ask you, this is totally unprompted, sorry to catch you off guard like that, but could you read at least part of that paragraph when you get down to about what the true masters, because that is such beautiful writing.
Oh, thank you. Sure. She knew how to be absorbed. So this is his client, Allison Kay, who he thinks is a famous singer. That was something else Jack had noticed about people who had attained mastery in a chosen discipline, that ability to be immersed. Focus was one thing and necessary, but it was active. The energy went from the actor to the activity. Okay, I'm casting now. I'll focus on casting. I'm painting. I'll focus on the canvas and the touch of my brush. I'm dancing. I will leap in cascading symmetries. What he noticed in all true masters was that the focus turned soon or immediately into full absorption by the act itself. The actor surrendered, and it was as if, like a change in tide, the energy was now flowing in the opposite direction from the river or the basketball court or the painting, flowing into the one who was doing. It swept her up and carried her. It fueled her, and in the most intense moments, allowed her to relax.
So beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a life lesson for anybody. And anyone reading this book can just stop right there and go, I've just learned something incredibly precious.
Well, you know, and it's good for writers. I mean, it's really good for writers coming up. You know, when you hear writers talk about, you know, they were in a fugue state, or, they were taking dictation or anything, that's not helpful to young writers because it sounds like magic, you know?
Right.
And, you know, if a young writer thinks, well, this is just magic or some religious experience, you know, then hell with it. What it really is about is taking, you know, a million foul shots. You know, it's about practicing a million drives. And then, you know, then, God willing, you can let it all go and get in the flow.
Right, right. Tim Cahill calls it Floby. He gets
Nice.
into Floby.
I like it.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about, to pull back out from the book a little tiny bit, because we're all sharing this extraordinary time of lockdown and pandemicness, and just to ask you kind of how you've gotten yourself through this. How have you navigated it? What do you tell yourself? What do you do to keep yourself vital? What have you been doing?
Yeah. So I want to tell you about the first night of lockdown. Denver went into lockdown March 24th. And I was fishing, and I was fishing right below a canyon, about half an hour south of Denver, where the South Platte comes out of this canyon and goes through this run of big old cottonwoods. And it's only half an hour south of my house, but you can sort of pretend you're way out there because it's so beautiful. The trees are so big and old, and the river is clear, and it's quiet. And so it's a part of a state park. And I drove through that evening, and there was no ranger at the gate. And there's always a ranger at the gate until after dark. And wow, that was really eerie. Nobody was there. I just drove in, and there was nobody. The big parking lot by the big lake, there were no cars there. And I wound around, and I got to the little gravel park, fisherman's parking lot, and there was 2 pickups. It's usually packed. And I walked down through the cottonwoods to the river, and there were 2 guys fishing, and they both seemed kind of wary. And one guy said, yes, the suckers are running. It's just suckers. And I got goosebumps, because in the Dog Stars, my first novel, there's a pandemic that's killed 99% of people, and all the trout are gone. There's only suckers and carp. And he fly fishes to stay connected with what he loves, but he pretends he's fishing for trout. So when he said the suckers are running, and there was no one around, I started fishing, and I felt like, hey, it was like life was imitating art. And then the sun set, I drove home, and there was no one on the road, and all the stores were shut, and the hair on the back of my neck just stood up. Right. So that was kind of crazy. And that summer, luckily, one of the things I love to do is to kayak, and it's something I've done, most of my life. And it was something we could do, socially distanced, because you're on the river in your own little boat, and when you have to run the shuttle, you can sit in the back of an open pickup truck, and it worked out. So I just spent a lot of time outside, and then the rest of the time I really worried about my sisters in New York City and my nieces, and I think that was the hardest part. My nieces are really active, and they joined all the Me Too protests and Black Lives Matter protests. And I knew there were big crowds, and they were kind of ground zero in New York City. And I really worried about them, but thank God everybody made it through.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you have any moments of feeling kind of untethered?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, for one thing, my routine, I usually go to a coffee shop to write, and, I was writing at home. I was, but yeah, I mean, mostly the untethering had to do with watching other people go through, their struggles, and, watching friends get sick. I mean, that was really scary.
Yeah.
So I got COVID, for 2 weeks. I was in bed, I couldn't even move.
I didn't know that. Oh, really?
Yeah. And it was because I was nice one night, and I let a couple who had driven all the way from Nebraska. It was winter and it was cold, and I let him in instead of making him sit outside, and that was a mistake. Oh well.
The last time you'll be kind to somebody.
Yeah, right. Heck with being nice.
Right. When you find yourself going towards rock bottom, what do you do to stop the descent, or
I found a long time ago that for me, being outside and getting exercises, that's how I self-medicate. Because what I write about, I write a lot about, as in The Guide, I write a lot about loss, and I find that's just where I come to, when I start writing. And I think that's why I love the Tang Dynasty poets so much. these guys are aficionados of loss. You know, they're kind of like this 8th century blues men. You know, I mean, in a few lines, these guys can put you, and women can put you knee deep in a mountain creek, crossing the creek with the mist shredding through the pines and a temple bell in the distance, and then just break your heart.
Right.
Know?
Right.
And I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Is writing part of that practice for you of putting things in, giving coherence to things or figuring things out?
I think it must be. Yeah. I mean, I think it's got to be. I mean,
yeah.
I'll sit at the, you know, because I write with this method of not plotting, I'm always surprised, right? I mean, it's like, it's sort of like, you know, because I came up paddling, when you run a river that hasn't been run or that you don't know at all, you come around a tight bend and you don't know what's going to be there. And it could be a cougar drinking or a waterfall or a flight of swallows or mayflies backlit in the sun or, you know, 5 people with weapons who don't want you to be there. You know, that has happened. And I love that thrill and that sense of discovery and surprise. And I wanted my writing to be like that. So I'll sit in the coffee shop and I'll be writing along, and all of a sudden something will happen, and I'll have tears dripping off my chin onto the table. And I know people in the coffee shop are thinking, that poor son of a bitch, you know, he's going through a bad divorce, or, you know, his dog just died. And really what's happening is, you know, you talk about if it's healing at all, you know, what's happening is that I'm more thrilled than I've been in my life, you know, at that moment, because I'm so transported, and it's got to be healing. I mean, if there's anything to heal, it's got to be cathartic. Right.
Do you put, so it sounds like you don't put expectations on your writing. You get in the kayak and you just take off and you see what's around the next bend, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, if you're paddling, you try and, you know, if there's a guidebook, you know, or someone to talk, you know, you're not stupid. But I love, you know, the other thing that I love is to break it up, you know, is to vary the method. Like, okay, so the Dog Stars was written in that sort of like white heat where I would just sit down and I would tell myself, don't think, just listen. And, you know, it was done in 7 months. I write 1,000 words a day, every day. I go just past 1,000 till I'm in the middle of something exciting. So I'm always stopping in the middle. I don't let myself run on, you know, I hold that energy. That way I wake up in the morning and I can't wait to get to work. You know, I never run through to a transition because that's white space, you know, it's like, so that's one trick. But, you know, the Dog Stars was this sort of fugue state feeling. And the next one, The Painter, I thought, you know, I better write this one fast because I've heard of second novel syndrome. If people respond to the Dog Stars good or bad, it's going to make pressure, right? So I wrote The Painter right away and started with the first line, started writing. And then I started thinking about it. And I started thinking, should my protagonist, Jim Stegner, the expressionist painter from Taos, he's got a commission in Santa Fe, when should he go? And should the brother of the guy that he killed with a rock, should he follow him bent on vengeance and you know, all that? And then I started thinking, I'm thinking about it. This can't be good because I didn't think about the last one. And that worked out, you know, and now I'm all of a sudden, I'm like wrought with, you know, and so this is a marvelous story. I've told it before, but I just love it. I was in Paonia, where this novel takes place, where Jim Stegner lives. And I'm in the little coffee shop where he meets his model, the very same one. And it's tiny. And you're going to talk to anyone who's in there. There's like one table. And guess who was in there? Paolo Bacigalupi, the great science fiction writer. I mean, this guy has written, you know, Hugo Award-winning books, bestsellers, you know, he's incredible. So we started talking about, you know, writing, and I started telling him about my struggle with thinking. And he's a lot younger than me, but he picked up his coffee cup and he said, "Sit down, son. I'm going to tell you a story." And he said, I wrote 2 short stories. One, one was like a fugue state. I sort of woke up and it was done, and I sent it in and it won a big award, and I love it. Second one, I plotted every single second. I designed the characters to interact a certain way, total authorial control through the whole thing. I sent it in, it won a big award, and I love it. And now when I look at them both, I can't tell the difference, and I love them both. And he leaned forward and he said, Your job is just to make sure it doesn't suck. And the whole creative burden just sort of lifted off my shoulders because I thought, that is something I can probably handle. What he was really saying, which is so marvelous, is, look, don't sweat it. Every story and every novel can have a different method. Sometimes you bootstrap it, you just let it rip, you have no idea. Other times you might want to plot. Other times you might want to just sort of loosely block out ahead, and that's what I did with The Painter. Or do Lee Child's method and, just throw everything up against the wall that you can think of as fast as possible. Right. Don't sweat it. Just make sure it's not terrible. You've got your craft, rely on revision, take out the stuff that's no good, and tighten up where it's slow, and you're good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is the ending a surprise too when you do that? Do you not know how it's going to end?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my God. The ending of The River just slayed me. I was just like, it was like, yeah. I mean, I couldn't friggin' move, after I wrote the ending.
Uh-huh.
So, wow. Yeah. And the ending of The Guide, I was just in tears as I was writing it, in a good way.
Right. So how do you, growing up writing nonfiction, moving to fiction, does nonfiction seem like a straitjacket now to you? Or how does that work?
Well, I mean, it's fun to write. I still write travel stories now and then because it's fun to go places. And those stories actually have been the seed of, several of the novels. The Guide sprung from a few travel stories that I did about fishing lodges, And I thought it was just kind of creepy that there's anticipatory service at 5-star lodges where you decide to go, you're going to take a sauna and someone meets you halfway down the path with a stack of towels. It's like, how did they know? But no, they're just, some of these places are fantastic, and it's sort of, but once you start making it all up, really there's no going back for me. I mean, it's just so fun. It's like, it just gets so immersed, and it's a way to live other lives. I mean, and then when I'm finished, these characters, this is the weird thing about writing fiction is that, and the wonderful thing, these characters live in my heart as if they're old friends. And like Jasper, the dog in the Dog Stars, he lives in my heart like a dog that I've had and that I've lost, and I still grieve him. It's like, it's kind of crazy. I mean, maybe 150 years ago, I'd be in a padded cell, right? Like my characters aren't really real, right?
Do they talk to you between books?
If they do, then that's a new book.
It's a new book.
Yeah, I think that's why The Guide happened, because Jack wanted to talk some more.
Jack showed up.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, let me go to some questions. I have a few more questions I wanted to ask you, but let me just go to some questions here from the wonderful viewers. Here's one. Have you published any poetry books?
No, I haven't, but last year I published a book called The Orchard, which was about, it's an ebook, and it was done by Scribd, which is a wonderful venture, audiobooks and ebooks. And it is the story of a legendary translator of Tang Dynasty poetry, particularly the work of Li Shui, woman poet in the 8th century. And she moves with her little daughter to a defunct orchard in southern Vermont. And her little daughter, Haley's little daughter, Frith, is 8 years old. And she narrates the book. It's in first person. So it's an 8-year-old girl,
wow,
first person narrating.
Great.
And the book is just about Frith and her mom, Haley, and their friend Rosie and their dog Bear. And it includes, a bunch of the poetry that Haley is translating by Li Shui. And so, there's a bunch of these Tang Dynasty poems in the book. And, Li Shui is fictional. So I had to write these poems in translation. And really a wonderful thing happened. I was reading the book in Crested Butte in their they have a stone library, old rock, true rock building. And I was reading upstairs at this library, and it was kind of a packed house. It was really fun. I was doing the river, and someone asked me what I was working on. And I said, I just finished The Orchard. I told them what it was about. And a woman came up to me And she said, I am a translator of Tang Dynasty poetry. That's what I do.
What?
I teach at this university. And
wow.
I said, oh my gosh, can I send you my manuscript? Can I please? And I did. And she wrote me back and she said, these poems are, they're wonderful and they pass. To me, they are classical Tang Dynasty poems. And I was just so proud. Like, so maybe Li Shui needs to have a whole book,
Right.
Cool.
That sounds good to me. Do you believe in reincarnation?
That's what it feels like. I mean, I got to say, that's one way I've described like being sort of transported into these characters is I feel like I am reincarnated. So I don't know if I believe in it, but I certainly feel like I'm having the experience when I'm writing.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. One question is, who did you read as a child? And then I wanted to ask who your real like literary mentors were, but who did you read as a child?
So, I started reading I believe it or not, I started reading like Yeats and Wallace Stevens when I was like 11 and 12. I read a lot of poetry. I just love the music and the language. I mean, Yeats, Prayer for My Daughter. I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the something bridge and elms scream. The music of it, I can't remember the whole first stanza now, but the music of it just slayed me. And I didn't really care what the poems were about. And under the arches of the bridge and scream in the elms above the flooded stream. I just loved it. And so I read, Emily Dickinson. It was just like blown away by the wit and the fun. And I read Eudora Welty, who I thought was so beautiful and lyrical. And I read, believe it or not, Faulkner. Mm-hmm. I read Hemingway short stories up in Michigan, the Nick Adams stories. And I just wanted to do that. I grew up in New York City, man. I just want, here's an 11-year-old kid in New York City reading that stuff. And I wanted to hop off a freight up in Michigan and with a rucksack and go camp by the Big 200 River and catch those big trout. And have a girlfriend that could row and fish like a man and then break up with her like in the end of something just because Nick did, It's funny when you're little what you want to do.
Right.
But I read all those folks. And then, as I grew a little older, then I read more and more in translation, and I just was crazy about Neruda. And I was later I started reading Murakami's novels, and he's just one of my all-time favorites. I'll read anything the guy writes. It was pretty Catholic and diverse.
Was there any particular writer who had a really seminal effect on you?
Yeah, but I don't want to say it because it's so. I mean, it's so unhip. But, but when I read In Our Time by Hemingway, I thought I want to do that because it was the first. I was 11 years old, and it was the first. And Hemingway, he has huge problems as a man,
right.
And a lot of the things, the way he was in the world, and his writing is in many ways, chauvinistic and all that. The rhythm of the prose and the succinctness and the clarity went through my skin and straight to my heart. And it was the first time I'd had that experience with prose. And I just thought, I just want to do something like this, And then it's weird. I knew what I had to do, even at 12 or 13. I knew that this writing, the voice was so infectious and could be so, in a way, it could just have too much of, it could just be too much ballast on the deck, on the port side. And so I read a lot of Faulkner, who's just, who can have sentences that are 2 pages long,
Right.
but it's also very lyrical, and then I sort of righted the ship that way. And I fell in love, with a long run on
right.
lyrical 50 clause sentence.
Right.
My father was a writer, and he would tell me, he'd read my stuff and he'd say, balance the short sentences with the long and stuff like that. And it helped a lot.
That's really great. I feel like there's a New Yorker cartoon of Hemingway and Faulkner in conversation.
Right.
There's a question, who are you reading now?
So oddly, I just finished a book by Machado de Assis, who's Brazilian, Portuguese in translation, written in 1899 called Dom Casmurro. And is one of the most avant-garde novels I've ever read. The thing is just incredibly brave and risk-taking and fun. And it sort of reclaims the fun and the satire of Don Quixote. And I was crazy about this book. I recently read, I was late to the party, and I recently read Deacon King Kong by James McBride, and I was crazy about it. I mean, what a writer. Oh my God. And this guy wrote about the projects in Red Hook, which is like a mile from where I grew up. And it was wonderful, wonderful to read.
Wow.
So, and I'm listening, I have to say, I love crime novels. And I listen to Louise Penny in audio, the cozy crime novels in Quebec, the woods.
Well, here's, speaking of that, here's a question. You bring so much darkness to your books along with fly fishing, as much as any writer I know. Can you speak to what informs that darkness along with the beauty of the sport?
Man, that's a good question. I have no idea. I mean, it's like, I think every writer is like a mountain spring. And, it's why I go back to Murakami. Like, I don't care what he writes about. I really don't. I'll read anything because the turn of his mind, the texture of it, the heft, the way it moves, the cadences. I just love it. And I think, and the sense of fun, I think every writer is like mountain water. And, you come to one mountain spring and it's clear and sweet, and another one has a little grit to it and maybe tastes a little minerally, and another one has sediment and is sort of like green. And my writing tends to have a lot of loss, as I said before. And, I wouldn't try and psychoanalyze why that is. I think I was just, born that way. I tuned, like, I love the blues. I loved the blues when I was like 9 years old. B.B. King was the first album that I bought. And I just, as soon as I heard the blues, I was like, changed my life, And so I think I've always been like those writers that I love in the Tang Dynasty, particularly attuned to loss. And I don't know.
When did you realize that the role of nature in your life? Because you grew up in the urban environments. When did nature first kind of enter your life and you went, oh, wow, this is...
Yeah, I was crazy about it ever since I was a tiny little kid. I mean, I was the kid in the bushes around the playground, and my cousins lived in Vermont, and I just, would go up to Vermont, and they lived in a very rural place up a dirt road, way up a ridge. And I never wanted to leave. Sunday night would come or the end of the week. And I was like, man, you guys go home.
Wow.
I'm staying here.
I'm home. That's really, really interesting. Do you have any sense about that? Like what that's all about?
I don't know. I just felt as a little kid, right? Ever since I felt most at home in wild places. Huh. And I used to think Vermont was the wildest place ever. And then right. What the truly wild place is,
Here's a question. In your writing, have you ever thrown it all against the wall and then have it not work out?
That's a great question. Well, the only time I tried this method was this book, and somehow it worked out. I do think that there's a lot of work that goes on the unconscious, and that's why I like stopping in the middle, because if I stop in the middle of a scene every day, you do all that work while you're sleeping. It's sort of like when you used to study for exam finals, and you'd study right before you slept. And
right.
I think a lot of problem solving goes on while we sleep. But maybe on a sort of less grand scale of the whole novel, I write along. So I heard a wonderful thing by Marvin Bell when I was he was a poet at Iowa, and he said something else that I've never forgotten about training to write. And this is where this helps a lot when I feel myself going into a cul-de-sac. And what I was going to say about Marilynne Robinson before was, and I think I got lost in that question, but was that she said she writes herself into corners and will get really depressed and, you know, like angst ridden. And then she writes herself out of them, out of these cul-de-sacs. But what Marvin Bell said was he loved to play tennis. And I don't know how good he was, but he said, you know, when you're practicing tennis, go ahead and when you hit a bad shot that goes over the fence into the street, follow that ball with your eyes. You know, he learned to do that. His coach told him that. Follow that ball with your eyes and watch it drop into the street just as much as you follow the zingers that goes flat over the net. Because what happens then is you learn the feeling of those bad shots. And after a while, you can do the micro adjustment as you're swinging and maybe get it to go where you want it to go. And it's sort of like that with writing. So nothing's wasted. I mean, all the ones that you crumple up and you throw in the trash can or that you hit delete or, you know, you put aside and, you know, that don't work. Those are so valuable because they're the bad shots that you're following with your eyes and you remember that feeling. So when I've written 1,000 stories that didn't work and 1,000 poems that I've crumpled up and thrown away. What I know from all that training is that when I'm writing along and I feel the energy dropping, I'm riding a mountain horse and, you know, this horse maybe knows better than me where to go and I'll let the reins run, but it has a little bit of a smaller brain than me. And it sometimes wants to go down into this arroyo or this cul-de-sac. Then I have that feeling that this isn't going to work. I just know from past experience, I can feel it. It's not going to work going this way. And I just nudge that horse over. I change the grip a little bit or whatever, and then keep running. So I would say on that more, you know, the smaller scale of in your paragraph running through the writing, you know, all that training is hugely helpful.
That's a great answer. I always feel like every step I've ever taken, I had to take. Whether it's that crumpled piece of paper or that thing that got published, you know, in the place I've always wanted to be published, each one is equally valuable.
Right.
Yeah. Do you teach?
I mean, I have, you know, little workshops and stuff. I love it. I love to teach. And that's why I know, because I know what's going to happen and then I won't write.
Right. Are you working on a new book?
I just finished one and Knopf just took it, which is I'm so pleased about. It's about an enforcement ranger in Yellowstone National Park who loves wolves better than people.
All right.
Gets him in some trouble.
Yeah. I love it. So, when you look back on your oeuvre, what do you think? I mean, you've written so many books. You've done a lot with your life. Do you feel content? Do you feel, what do you feel when you kind of look back at it all? What do you
feel like I'm just getting started. Like I'm just like learning about what it means to write a novel. And I'm just praying for the years to let it rip.
Wow. Do you have an unfinished dream?
Yeah. I mean, I would like to write, more books that will break the universe open for the reader.
That's what a beautiful answer. Yeah. Well, I mean, your writing does break the universe open, and that's such an incredible gift. As a reader, as an editor, as a writer, I learn from you every single time I read you, and it's an honor. It's an honor to know you. It's a thrill to read you. And thank you so much for sharing yourself, Peter, with us today.
So great to see you again, or maybe the first time after our history. It's like the closing of a circle. I love it. Thank you for what you do. And thanks for a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you. Right. I look forward to the next one.
All right. Yeah.
All righty. That sounds like my cue. Oh, there I am. Hello. Nice. Sounds like my cue. What an absolutely excellent conversation. Double thank you, by the way, to everybody that was talking in the chat. there were like many more questions that got put in there. We just didn't have the time to get to them all because we were talking and learning and having such a great time. And double thank you to everybody who just had nice things to say and no questions that were in there. I'm gonna relay everything to these two after after we're signed off. So I promise it'll all get over there. So I appreciate it, including all the people that are writing now. I'll be able to see it after the show. The book is The Guide. Make sure that if you order it, you get it from one of your independent stores. And although obviously I really hope that you get it from Book Passage, we can ship it to your house just like any of those online retailers that you may happen to think of, but I will not speak their name aloud here. But nonetheless, even if you don't get it from us, get it from one of your local indie stores. We love all of them equally, and we're always very happy. You can there's a number of different ways to find them. Please go out and support them if you're not going to support us. We're really happy. Tell them Book Passage sent you, that you saw the book on a Book Passage TV. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming out tonight, everybody. Thank you one last time to Don and Peter for such a wide-ranging and lovely conversation. I hope most of all that we see all of you wonderful human beings watching in the chat, watching in the audience today in the next one. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That was awesome.